Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We're delighted to have you here. Thanks to the students that took the time out to come in today. That's awesome. You're actually here. I'm a historian, so this is a historic occasion because this is the first time that this has ever happened, that the University of Texas and Texas A&M San Antonio have had a collaborative, event. So this is history in the making. I'm Edward Westerman. I'm a Regents Professor of History at Texas A&M San Antonio. I'm also a colleague of Dr. Kiser, which is why I'm introducing him today. But before I do that, I do want to thank some folks. The Schusterman Center, and we have Dr. Jonathan Kaplan is here. Emily, who works the administration, has been part of this. Tatiana Lichtenstein, Dr. Tatiana Lichtenstein, has been awesome making this happen. The HEF, the Holocaust Educational Foundation, has been also great. And Vanda, I know you're here. There you are. Thank you again for everything, the HEF, and what you have done personally. Thanks to everyone who's collaborated in this as well. And finally, Humanities Texas has also been supporters of this talk. So I want to thank them as well. Normally, what you would have is the presenter would just read you the bio of the person that is speaking. I'm going to do it a little bit differently. I'm going to go back about 7 years ago because I was actually on the search committee that hired Dr. Kiser to come to Texas A&M San Antonio. And on a search committee, many in here have done that. What you do is you look at records of people who are applying. And it's not unusual to have somebody apply for the position of assistant professor that is publishing their dissertation. And Dr. Kiser was on peonage, slavery in New Mexico with the University of Pennsylvania Press, which was very impressive. But what you don't often see is someone that also published their master's degree with Oklahoma University. And then what you never see is someone that published their senior thesis with Texas A&M University Press. So by the time we got Billy, he had 3 books. Since then, he's got 3 more. And the one that he's going to be talking to you today about is his newest book, which is coming out with Yale. It's Scalp Warfare, Colonial Conquest, and Genocide Across Indigenous America, which will be appearing next year, I believe. It's in production right now. And the other thing, if you really want to get a preview of it, in the last Journal of American History, Billy published an article, The Business of Killing Indians, which this book is based on and which his talk is based on. So an incredibly talented young academic who doesn't look like he should be as old as he is. So Billy, we're delighted to have you here, and good luck.
Thank you all for having me today. Thank you, Ed and Tatiana for organizing this. Emily, Fonda, for all of your help as well in putting this event together. I've really enjoyed meeting many of you over the last day or so. I've enjoyed all the sessions today. As somebody who is not a historian of 20th century Europe, I can honestly say I have learned a lot today. I've felt much more like a student than a participant in the conference. So I really do appreciate this opportunity. I'm going to simply begin by, as with all topics related to genocide, this is a difficult and dark topic. Although this has nothing to do with 20th century Europe, it does have everything to do with the way that we think about genocide in global perspective. So I'm going to take us today back to the 19th century and to the U.S. Mexico borderlands, specifically northern Mexico and southern New Mexico. And I've titled this The Business of Killing Indians. And as you'll see over the course of my talk today, part of the reason for the title, The Business of Killing Indians, is to point to the ways in which earlier this morning we were looking at photographs in one of the sessions, and many people were commenting on just how on the normality of behavior you know, women smiling and laughing, walking down the street while a Jewish person is being publicly humiliated, of 4 young men smiling in a photograph, posing with an anti-Jewish slogan on their car, and just the normalization of hateful behavior that then morphs into genocide. And what happened in Mexico in the mid-1800s was also very normalized in such a way that many men literally made a business out of killing Indians through what I call scalp warfare. So I want to begin with some broad context, and some of this will be very familiar to you all. Raphael Lemkin, of course, coins the term genocide, specifically to describe the Holocaust events in Nazi Germany. And of course, the United Nations Resolution 260 here outlining definitions of genocide. And I use that as sort of a framework for analyzing scalp warfare in 19th century Mexico. But there were some differences here. There were some different permutations going on with scalp warfare. So to begin with, I'm wading into the waters of the Native American genocide debate, which has a debate that's been going on for decades, a very contentious debate among scholars, among activists, and there are, generally speaking, 2 sort of camps within this debate. There's the lumping camp and the splitting camp. And the lumping approach to the Native American genocide debate essentially argues that all 400 years of North American colonial history were one enormous monolithic act of genocide against all Native peoples. And this typically relies on massive population decline. About 90% of the indigenous population of North America perished in the first 150 or so years after Columbus's arrival in 1492. Although the overwhelming majority of that 90% decline was due to illness, the spread of illnesses to which those Native peoples did not have immunity. That side of the debate does not account for individual indigenous tribes, tribal nationhood. It basically takes Native Americans as a single group, which is problematic for many reasons in itself. The splitting side of the argument, which is what I'm sort of embracing with this project, looks at specific events in different times and different places, looks at specific Indian tribes to identify individual moments or processes of genocide. So this really speaks to the experiences of each tribe with colonialism over time. And what we find if we adopt this splitting approach is that many Native American tribes did not experience genocide. Many did experience colonialism, they experienced violence, but certainly not genocide as we would frame it here. But you do also encounter specific instances, specific tribes and times and places where a very, very strong argument can be made for genocide having occurred. And one of these times and places is mid-19th century Mexico, specifically in the states of Sonora, Chihuahua, and Coahuila. So I'm using this splitting approach to sort of get at the framing of the genocide argument with respect to Native American history. And the broader point here, and that I'm hoping that, that readers of the book eventually will take away, is that this is a more realistic and responsible way of thinking about Native American genocide. So I've proposed the term and concept scalp warfare to describe a very specific type of colonial violence that occurred throughout North America, including Mexico, the United States, and Canada, in different times and places from the 1600s through the 1800s. And scalp warfare shares some of the characteristics that we would be familiar with 20th century Europe, but it also has some characteristics that differentiate it in the context of genocide. Scalp warfare involves indiscriminate tactics, targeting men, women, and children of specific indigenous groups who were viewed as enemies of the state. And in the case of northern Mexico, this was predominantly the Apache tribe. It involves localized government sponsorship. In almost every instance, national governments disavowed this type of activity. They condemned it rhetorically. They didn't, the Mexican government in Mexico City never took any type of concrete action to prevent this from occurring, but they rhetorically distanced themselves from these tactics that local state legislatures were enacting in Sonora, Chihuahua, and Coahuila. And what these local governments were doing was implementing scalp acts or scalp laws to pay bounties, cash bounties, for the scalps of native peoples, specifically Apaches in this case. And in the broader context of North American history, scalp bounties were quite common. These occurred very commonly in the English and British colonies, beginning in the mid-1600s all the way through the late 1700s. They occurred in French Canada, in French Louisiana, to a lesser degree in Gold Rush era California, and even in some instances here in Texas in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, involving the Texas Rangers and the Comanches. So localized government sponsorship is a crucial component, and it speaks to the ways in which in these borderlands settings, national governments or empires, powers were often unable to assert power and control over the region, and this left local actors to sort of fend for themselves and to formulate their own policies and laws that oftentimes even contradicted those of the nation. In one instance, for example, in 1692, the French governor in Quebec implemented a scalp bounty, and the king, as Louis XIV, I think, struck it down and said, "No, I'm not paying scalp bounties." And the governor, of course, who is half a world away, wrote back and said, "Tough, I'm doing it anyways." That's rather unusual for a governor to just literally go against the orders of a king, but it speaks to the ways in which local actors exercised a lot of autonomy in these borderlands environments across North America. Scalp warfare almost invariably involved civilian paramilitary operatives. This doesn't mean that traditional armed forces or militaries never committed these types of atrocities, never committed acts of corporeal mutilation or scalping, but in the framework of scalp warfare, these local governments were contracting with civilians, creating a business opportunity, paying them, and in many cases, especially in Mexico, they literally had written contracts that scalp hunters entered into with the Mexican government, so formalizing this business arrangement. Now, these civilian paramilitary operatives, they operated at the same time as traditional military forces, but not in cooperation or conjunction with them. So it was not unusual in the 1830s and 40s and 50s for Mexican troops, the regular Mexican army, to be on a campaign in Apacheria, in Apache homelands, at the same time that a scalp hunting unit of civilians under contract with the state of Chihuahua was also in the field pursuing Apaches to kill them and then claim the bounty money. So financial incentives are another major element of scalp warfare. It's basically monetized killing, with the body part being one scalp hunter literally referred to the scalps as his receipts. He took receipts. And he referred to it when he would go into Chihuahua, to the state capital, Ciudad Chihuahua, he went to, quote, cash the hair. So again, speaks to just the normality, the normalization of this as a business practice, when in fact it was indiscriminate murder and mutilation of Native Americans. So the result of this in 19th century Mexico is a series of genocidal massacres that are perpetrated by several different scalp hunting units. There were multiple men who contracted with the Mexican government, and each one had their own sort of company, if you will, of several dozen men who rode with them as scalp hunters. So in several of the largest massacres, between 100 and 200 Apaches were killed in a single event, and then scalped, and then the scalp hunters were paid. The scalps, there were different bounties that were implemented in different years, but they typically ranged from 100 to 200 pesos per scalp, which was roughly equivalent to $100 to $200 at the time, so a significant amount of money. Just to put that into context, one Apache scalp was worth far more than the wages that the average Mexican laborer earned in an entire year. So there was a major incentive for average everyday citizens to step aside from whatever it was that from their avocation and to take up scalp hunting. And I also frame scalp warfare within two sort of theoretical constructs: extralethal violence and violent display. And I borrow both of these terms from the late political scientist Leanne Fuji. She writes about extralethal violence and violent display in her book. It was published posthumously a couple of years ago. It's called Showtime. And this is another crucial element to scalp warfare. With extralethal violence, a good way of sort of understanding this is it's not how many people are killed isn't as important as how they are killed. It's the performative aspect of it. Certainly, scalp hunters wanted to kill as many Apaches as they could. The more they killed, the more money they made. But there was, and this is where the colonial racism sort of undergirds this performative aspect to not just murder, but to then mutilate through intense racial hatred, the corpses of the people that you have murdered, and then in acts of violent display to celebrate celebratory rituals, to celebrate these genocidal massacres by displaying the scalps publicly. In one instance, for example, they strung the scalps in front of the Catholic Cathedral in Ciudad Chihuahua, and they had a parade, and the Catholic priest led the parade through town, celebrating the massacre of about 150 Apaches in 1846. And there were numerous instances of this occurring. So even after the murders had been committed, the killing was done, there was a prolonged period of celebratory ritual. Oftentimes, scalp hunters would especially in California and Texas, they would nail scalps to the front door of their house as a symbol to everybody in town. These men became celebrities in their local communities. They would tie scalps to their saddles, to their horses, in some cases even to their guns, and it was a way of keeping track of kills and also sort of demonstrating to those around them what they had done. So a lot of different elements at play here within scalp warfare that make it a very specific type of tactic for colonial conquest in North America. So before I get into the specifics of northern Mexico and scalp hunting in the U.S. Mexico borderlands, a quick map just to sort of situate us with where we're at here. I'm not going to actually mention all the locations on this map. The map is taken from the book manuscript. So, but much of what I talk about today occurs in Chihuahua, Sonora, and Coahuila. And of course, the international boundary that you see there between U.S. and Mexico did not exist when many of these events occurred. That boundary was created in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The scalp bounties that went into effect actually started in 1837. So for 12 years, 11 years until 1848, New Mexico was also part of Mexico. That boundary, the international boundary, didn't exist yet. And one of the things about and after that boundary was put in place, one of the things about these civilian scalp hunting units was that they did not have to abide by international boundaries in the same way that the Mexican Army did and the United States Army did. The Mexican Army could not, because Apacheria, the line, the international boundary was just drawn right through the middle of Apache homelands. That line meant nothing to Apaches. Apache homelands went deep into Mexico and went up into central New Mexico and Arizona today. So Apaches moved at will across that border, but if the United States Army was pursuing Apaches, they had to stop at the border. If they went into Mexico, then that would be considered an armed invasion of a foreign country, and vice versa. If the Mexican Army was in the field, they could not cross into the United States. So this was another creative technique that local state governments used to get around, after 1848, to get around that international boundary, because these civilian operatives crossed the border at will and were not bound in the same way that, that traditional militaries were. One of the most detailed descriptions of a scalping massacre in Mexico comes from George Frederick Ruxton. Ruxton was from England. He was only in his 20s. He had enlisted in the British Army at the age of 13. He served in Spain, he served in Canada, he served in Africa. And in 1846, when the U.S. Mexico War began, Ruxton went to Mexico as an observer. And he published an account a couple of years later in 1848 of his travels through Mexico, observing the U.S. Army's invasion of Mexico. And Ruxton spent about 4 to 5 pages in that book, more than he spent on really any other topic in over a year of traveling through Mexico, explaining the 1846 Galeana massacre, in which James Kirker, one of the most well-known prolific scalp hunters, and his followers killed about 150 Apaches. And Ruxton was clearly bothered and I would even say flabbergasted by the scene that he saw in Ciudad Chihuahua. By the time he got there, the massacre was over, but he saw over 150 scalps strung out on the town plaza directly in front of the church. And he was also struck at the fact that these were displayed in front of the church. Right? So he's drawing connections with religion, the fact that the Catholic priest in town had led the parade. They all, initially they put all the scalps on lances and poles and paraded through town. Music was playing in this sort of celebratory, triumphal type of a ritual. And Ruxton did not hide his disgust for what he had seen here. This is Ciudad Chihuahua as it would have appeared when Ruxton was there in about mid-century. This is 1850, 4 years after Ruxton was there. And that's the Catholic church that you see in the center of the picture there, in front of which the scalps were being displayed in 1846. So the massacre that Ruxton was describing occurred not in Ciudad Chihuahua, but in a town to the north of there called Galeana. And the Galeana massacre was really the culmination of about 10 years of local government contracting with scalp hunters. The first instance went back to 1837. And in 1837, an American by the name of John Johnson. Most of the men who led these scalp hunting units in Mexico were actually Americans who went to Mexico specifically for the purpose, and then they recruited men in Mexico to join their ranks. The first instance is in 1837, John Johnson, and in all of these instances, treachery is at the forefront of the tactics. And in many cases as well, alcohol was used strategically to debilitate the victims ahead of the massacre. It would have been very difficult for a group of a couple dozen men to achieve the murder of over 150 Apache men who were very skilled fighters had they not debilitated them ahead of time with alcohol. So in many of these cases, they would fly a white flag. A group of Apaches would come in to have what they would call a trade fair. They would spend a couple of days, just trading ammunition, food, just different articles and goods. And then over the course of that trade fair, the scalp hunters would distribute whiskey, other types of liquor in bottomless quantities, and then they would spring their trap when the men were when many of them had drank to excess. In the first instance in 1837, Johnson killed 20 Apaches. He had a cannon concealed underneath his food sacks in his wagon, and after 2 days of trading with a group of Apaches, they pulled the sacks off of the cannon and let loose, and with one blast killed 20 Apaches, scalped them, went to the state capitol, and were paid the bounty reward, which was equivalent to over $1,000 in cash at the time. And if you were to adjust that for inflation, I did the numbers a couple of years ago, a $1,000 payout would be roughly about $30,000 to $40,000 today. So a significant amount of money at that time. The Galeana Massacre in 1846 was James Kirker, who was from Ireland, born in the 1790s, immigrated to the United States in 1810. I have a picture of him on the next slide. And eventually finds his way to Mexico and contracts with the local government in Mexico. The Galeana Massacre is documented in a lot of different primary sources, and also in a lot of Apache oral histories. It's of all the events in Apache history, that particular massacre, I would say, looms the largest in Apache, not just oral history, but also oral tradition, in the way that it is still remembered even today. So that's a really important source for understanding the Apache perspective, the perspective of the victims here, who otherwise did not leave behind written records of it, but have passed those stories down, and those have, in many cases, been documented by ethnographers. So here's Ruxton describing 160 men, women, and children were slaughtered, and with the scalps carried on poles, Kirker's party entered Chihuahua with bands of music escorting them in triumph. John Russell Bartlett, who was in charge of the U.S. Boundary Commission in the early 1850s, traveling through the region, he says that the Indians feel the deepest hatred towards the Mexicans is true. Acts of treachery of the grossest and cruelest description have been practiced by the Mexicans towards them. Treachery, he's referring to the use of the white flag of truce, of alcohol, etc., as antecedent to massacre. Some time ago, this is Mangas Coloradas, one of the leading Apache chiefs of the time. Some time ago, my people were invited to a feast. Aguardiente or whiskey was there. My people drank and became intoxicated and were lying asleep when a party of Mexicans came in and beat out their brains with clubs. This is this is published in what's famously called the Doolittle Report in 1867 after the Civil War on the condition of Indian affairs. But and this is a quote that he told to an Indian agent in New Mexico. And finally, Jason Betzina's Apache, 20th century Apache, whose story was published. They fell to work with sharp knives, wrenching off the gory trophies for which they would receive gold and silver from their authorities. So you see all the business connotations again here, right? They'd receive gold and silver in compensation. This is James Kirker on the left. He is the only actual scalp hunter from 19th century Mexico that we have a photograph of. Luis Terrazas and Ignacio Pesqueira were the governors of Chihuahua and Sonora who were partially responsible for implementing the bounty laws and contracting with Kirker and other scalp hunters in the 1840s and 50s. So Terrazas and Pesqueira were certainly complicit in the genocide, although they did not personally perpetrate the massacres. Kirker did. And there were about half a dozen other men who, over a period of about 20 years, from the 1830s to 1860s, also led these civilian scalp hunting companies. But again, Kirker is the only one that we have a photo of. That photo was taken in St. Louis about 1848. Kirker ends up dying in California in the early 1850s. He followed the gold rush. He left Mexico in 1849 and followed the gold rush. In a profound moment of irony in this story, in 1846, as the U.S. Army was invading Mexico as part of the U.S. Mexico War, this was just a few months after the Galeana Massacre, and the local government in Chihuahua City failed to pay Kirker the full amount that he felt that they owed him based on his contract for those approximately 160 Apache scalps. They paid him some of the money, but not all of it. So he was angry with the local government because he felt that they owed him money and that they had cheated him in this business transaction. So Kirker then in December of 1846, he leaves Mexico and joins Colonel Alexander Doniphan's Missouri Volunteer Regiment as they are marching south down the Rio Grande into Chihuahua, and acts as an interpreter and a guide for them as the U.S. Army invades Mexico. So he turns on the state of Chihuahua, and in response to this, the Chihuahua government put a bounty on his head of 10,000 pesos. So truly ironic that the scalp hunter becomes the wanted person with a bounty on his head. The bounty was never collected because nobody ever, and he went to California and he died of natural causes in California a couple of years later. Now, you'd have to wonder, 10,000 pesos was a tremendous amount of money, far more than the Mexican government even owed him on his contract to begin with. So I think that in a lot of ways that was sort of symbolic on the government's part, and probably with not really an expectation that somebody would actually track down Kirker, kill him, and then present his scalp for the reward money. After Kirker leaves Mexico in 1846, the local governments begin, they basically, prior to Kirker's departure, scalp hunting and scalp warfare was limited to a small number of individuals who had contracts directly with the local governments. After Kirker leaves Mexico, those local governments open up scalp hunting to anybody who wishes to participate, and it no longer requires a special contract with the government. And in addition, prior to Kirker's departure, only the state of Chihuahua enacted scalp bounties. After Kirker leaves, beginning in the late 1840s, Sonora and Coahuila join and also enact scalp bounties. So scalp warfare then spreads to 3 states instead of 1 across northern Mexico. So the law that was passed that opens up scalp warfare to anybody who wishes to participate was called Ley Quinta, or the 5th law. And it called for what they called contratas de sangre, blood contracts, which was more sort of a metaphor than anything. But it gives you a sense of again, the direct connection between the business aspect of this, just the normalized everyday mentality, and the actual killing and mutilation of those who were murdered. And these quotes give you a sense again of just how normalized this was. Here's the governor of Chihuahua. It might not be more than a kind of evil business, just kind of a so what mentality. Here's the Chihuahua newspaper correspondent. The expedition of Kirker appears good. This is right after the Galeana massacre. Now perhaps is the best time for success over the tribes, because the adversity ought to diminish their barbarity. So what is he saying there? He's saying, Kirker has just perpetrated this massacre. Don't stop now. Bring more people on. Continue. Bring more. Contract with more scalp hunters. Don't let up. Now is and notice also the use of the word barbarity. So the rhetoric here, which was extremely common, not just in Mexico but across the 19th century United States and the American West, the rhetoric of savagery and barbarity and sort of dehumanizing the victims, which again shares a lot of similarities with Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. So the term indios bárbaros was basically a synonym for Apaches, and it was used all of the time, and literally translated barbaric or barbarian Indians. So the dehumanizing rhetoric is really central to this as well. War to the death with the Apaches. our Chihuahuan hero, there is no stain in his story, describing Kirker. So again, these men were seen as heroes throughout Mexico. 200 pesos, alive or dead, of whatever sex, except for little children. So the indiscriminate nature of it, and again, the except for little children part is more of a rhetorical gesture. A scalp hunter who scalped an Apache child was not denied the bounty for that scalp. This was just a way for Mexican officials to rhetorically distance themselves, and I think even maybe appease their own conscience, saying, well, we're telling them not to kill the little kids at least. So at least it's not, but it really was indiscriminate. And they did pay bounties for any scalps, regardless of age or gender. These are just a small sampling of the Mexican sources on scalp bounties, scalp warfare, and I include these primarily to demonstrate once again just the normalization of scalp warfare and genocide perpetrated against the Apaches. So, on the upper left, this is taken from the weekly state newspaper in Chihuahua, and this is the law, Ley Quinta, the new scalp law that was passed in 1849. So it's being announced in the newspaper for anybody who wishes to participate. And it's laying out each article of the scalp law, and it's telling you the different payout amounts. So adult men were, the scalp of an adult man was worth more than an adult woman, and the scalp of an adult woman was worth more than that of a child, but they all were redeemable for cash. And they also paid bounties for captives as well, who were then sold into slavery in Mexico. So there was some captive taking that occurred alongside the murders, but most of the time the preference was to kill and not to capture. This is James Kirker's journal, his diary that he kept on the campaign that culminated in the massacre at Galeana. So he's literally keeping a diary and recording this day to day as just routine activity for him, as he's going about murdering and mutilating literally over 100 people. And they published his diary in the weekly newspaper for everybody to read. Again, these men became heroes for this. And this one here is from 1839, and this is from basically the daily notes of the legislature. And this is in 1839, the Chihuahua legislature created what they called the Society for Making War Against the Barbarians. Again, the use of the terminology, the barbarians. But this was a legislative enactment creating a paramilitary organization of scalp hunters and giving it the name, the Society for Making War Against the Barbarians. So sort of, in a way, legitimizing this through the Mexican legal system. And this Society for Making War Against the Barbarians was funded by donations and by taxpayers. They raised the taxes to fund, to fill the treasury so that they could pay out the bounties. So this makes even citizens who were not participating alongside the scalp hunters and were not perpetrating the massacres were nonetheless complicit in the acts by virtue of funding it through various mechanisms. And finally, every single issue of the weekly newspaper carried an update on Apache affairs. And it was either titled, in this case, Apaches, or often interchangeably, Indios Barbaros, as I said a moment ago. And so every week this was in the newspaper, and sometimes it was much longer than others, but this is from June 26, 1849. This is just 3 weeks or so after Ley Quinta went into effect, the new Scalp Act in 1849. So in a matter of just 3 weeks of the new scalp law going into effect, this is a report in the newspaper saying, certifica que el ciudadano de los Estados Unidos del Norte, J.J. Glanton, that's John Joel Glanton, I'll say more about him in a moment, ha presentado 5 caballeras de otros cantos indios muertos en la Sierra de Ternates. So they're saying the American, the U.S. citizen, John Joel Glanton, has presented 5 Indian scalps. So he's just arrived in the state capitol, and he's presented 5 Apache scalps. And then it goes on to say, siendo 4 de hombres adultos y una chica. So 4 of them were from adult men, and 1 was a young girl. Con más 3 prisioneros, so he took 3 captives as well. 2 jóvenes menores de 14 años, 2 young children of 14 years of age, y una india por lo menos de 12, and 1 young girl more or less 12 years of age. So he's just killed 5, captured 3, and the newspaper is reporting on this just very matter-of-factly that the bounties have been paid out to him. And I use this one in particular because it mentions John Joel Glanton. He was one of the several American scalp hunters that operated in Mexico at this time, but he's probably the most well-known publicly today, even though many people might not realize it, because if anybody is familiar with the book Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy, that book is very closely based on John Joel Glanton and his company of scalp hunters in Mexico. Cormac McCarthy, who just passed away last year, very, very well-known author, and that book in particular he wrote, I think, 1985. He actually moved to El Paso. He got a MacArthur Genius Grant that funded this. He moved to El Paso, learned to speak Spanish, and researched the archives, researched the topic to learn about it, and then to write his book. So even though there's not a character in the book named John Joel Glanton, the lead character in the book is based on Glanton. And a lot of the events in the book, if you follow the history, the actual historical events really closely, you can correlate them to actual events that occurred. He doesn't always have them in the same order that they occurred historically, but there are about 6 different massacres that he describes in that book, and I can identify every one of them, which one he's actually talking about, even though it's a work of fiction. It's very closely based on reality. And that book is also very well known for its incredibly grotesque descriptions of violence. It's a difficult book to read, just the way that McCarthy, and in many ways it's fitting, because the topic that he's describing, I think that he really does justice in those in his writing, in his descriptions of the violence, and it really, as much or more so than any of my research in the actual historical documents, reading McCarthy's book really kind of hits home about just the level of the brutality and the violence, and it really just, for me, having researched the topic, really just kind of makes you think of and realize just how horrific this was. So what are the Apache perspectives on all of this? This is Geronimo. Many of you likely recognize him. This is taken in 1898. I chose this picture showing him later in life because it roughly corresponds just 8 years prior to the publication of his autobiography, which he dictated to an ethnographer who then published that in 1906. So this is more or less how Geronimo would have looked in 1906 when his autobiography was published. And he talks in that book about scalp warfare and the effect that it had on him personally and his Apache people. Geronimo himself lost a wife, a mother, and 3 children in one of these scalping massacres in 1850. So he had a lot of personal anguish from this. And when Apaches in the oral history and oral tradition, when they talk about scalping, the term for it is bitsa adogis, and it translates to his head top cut off. So it's basically a descriptive kind of a translation from an Apache perspective on scalping. And Geronimo, in I think one of the most poignant lines in his book, says, it has been a long time since then. He's referring to the 1850s when he was a young man and when his family was massacred. But I still have no love for the Mexicans. I am old now and shall never go on the warpath again. But if I were young and followed the warpath, it would lead into old Mexico. That really says a lot. For all of the many years of conflict that Geronimo encountered with the U.S. Army in the 1860s and 70s and 80s, when he's telling his story later in life, it's Mexico that he's singling out. If I was young enough and if I could go on the Apache, the word for it was the warpath, right? If I could, I would go straight into old Mexico. It gives you a sense of the deep hatred and animosity that developed largely as a result of scalp warfare and the ways in which scalp warfare, more so than other more traditional forms of conflict and violence, really impacted the Apache ethos and Apache identity. And to really understand the sort of spiritual and human impact that scalp warfare had on Apaches, you have to understand that Apaches believed that, as James K. Wakela, another Apache, is describing here, that the body will go through eternity in the condition in which it leaves the earth. So for an Apache, it wasn't just murdering a loved one, a friend or family member, but the act of mutilating the body afterwards took it so much further, because for them it meant that that deceased loved one is now going to spend an eternity in the afterlife in a physically mutilated condition. And when the surviving relatives and family and friends, when they someday die and meet their loved ones again, they're going to encounter them in their mutilated state. So that's really crucial for understanding Geronimo's comment here and Apache perspectives on this. It wasn't just killing, it was something far more sinister that deeply impacted Apache identity. Jason Betzina is another Apache. The chiefs considered for a long time the action which they should take to pay back the Mexicans. And here he's referring again to that Galeana massacre in 1846. The desire for vengeance burned more fiercely as the days and weeks passed. The Apaches were not, I don't want to create any illusions that they were passive victims in all this. They very much, they were victims, but they very much had the ability to reciprocate. The Apache tribe numbered about 3,000 or so people at the time, and in every instance of a scalping massacre, they would organize afterwards what they would call a war party, and they would ride into Mexico on what they called a vengeance campaign, attacking towns and villages, so this really creates sort of a reciprocal and long-running sort of violence between the Mexican people and Apaches that lasts for many decades in the 19th century. Ace DeClugy says, not until both Mexicans and white eyes is the term that Apaches used for white people, scalped some of our people did Apaches resort to it. Little did white eyes know what they were starting when they mutilated our people. I have seen these things done. So he's saying that in Apache history, they did not practice scalping or mutilation of corpses until the Mexicans and Americans did it to them first. Then they began doing it as well. So as a result of these Mexican scalp bounties and scalp warfare, on those vengeance campaigns, Apaches did not only kill Mexicans who they encountered, but they also scalped them and in other ways mutilated the corpses as a form of reciprocity. And all of that, again, really sort of plays into this extremely deep animosity that develops. You can see in Geronimo's language there. So really quickly, I just want to provide a little bit of additional sort of context of scalp warfare as it occurs in other times and places, because it's not just Mexico. 19th century Mexico is one of the clearest manifestations of scalp warfare. And in the case of Mexico and the Apache tribe, in terms of statistics, in terms of casualty figures, as I said a moment ago, the Apache tribe numbered about 3,000 people in the 1840s when scalp warfare really began. And through the best accounting that I've been able to do through the documents, I estimate that roughly 1/3 of the Apache tribe was killed, eliminated through scalp warfare over a period of about 20 years. So a pretty significant proportion of the tribe perishes as a result of this. And scalp warfare, as I said earlier, it existed prior to Mexico. It existed in French Louisiana, French Canada, the British colonies, and it also gravitated out of Mexico with the gold rush into California, and it became a very prominent form of colonial violence in the 1850s in California. And Ben Madley has written about this in his book, An American Genocide, on California Native Americans. In some cases, scalp hunters from Mexico literally went to California and started perpetrating the same forms of violence there. Kirker went to California. Glanton attempted to go to California and didn't make it. He was ambushed and killed along the Colorado River at the Gila crossing near Yuma, Arizona today in 1850. John Coffey Hayes, famous in Texas Ranger history. Hayes led a Texas Ranger unit in the early 1840s in the Republic of Texas, and he and his men carried out a number of massacres of Comanches and Lapon Apaches in Texas and scalped the victims. Hayes moves to California in the early 1850s, becomes mayor of San Francisco, and one of the first things that he does as mayor of San Francisco is he raises 2 volunteer companies, which was basically another manifestation of Rangers, Texas Rangers, and sends them into the field to hunt and kill Indians in his terms. So he's taking the forms of scalp warfare that he practiced in Texas and the Texas-Mexico borderlands, he's taking them with him to California, and the scalp warfare tactic thus moves geographically. Ben Wright on the left. Ben Wright was in many ways California's version of James Kirker. Ben Wright was a Quaker, but was far from a pacifist. Ben Wright massacred in 1850 a group of Modoc Indians in Northern California, killed several dozen of them, scalped them. In his case, there was not a bounty in place to redeem for the money, so he decorated his home with the scalps, and again, this is the violent display aspect, the performative aspect of scalp warfare. And he became very much a local hero in the gold rush towns of Northern California for this, and others followed in his footsteps. They followed his example and carried out similar scalping massacres throughout the 1850s and 60s in California. This is a California war bond of the state of California. This is $23. This is the way that the California, and again, this is the regional or local government sponsorship. This was not the United States government. This was the local government in the state of California raising money through war bonds to fund these volunteer companies like the ones that John Coffey Hayes raised in San Francisco. To fund them and to pay them as they practiced scalp warfare. And the top photo there are the graves of 4 Modoc Indians who were executed in 1873. When these were the descendants of the same Modocs who Ben Wright had massacred in 1850, and in a really sort of symbolic and even sort of ironic kind of a twist, these 4 Modoc Indians were convicted of murder. a treaty council. They killed General Edward Canby and a couple of others, and they were arrested for this. They were convicted of murder, and they were all hung. And after they were cut down from the gallows, one of the army officers at the fort where they were executed went with scissors and cut off pieces of their hair and sold it as souvenirs to all of the spectators who had come out to watch the execution. So again, you see just how normalized selling body parts of Native Americans and profiting from it in various ways. And finally, just to go even broader in perspective, I'll conclude with this. And this is all topics that I cover in the book-length version of this that'll be out next year. There you see on the top left, Iroquois pictograph showing a group of Iroquois Indians with scalps. In French Canada and French Louisiana, many of the scalp hunters were actually Native American, and they were allied with the French governments, and they would attack other Native American tribes that they had longstanding conflicts with, and then they would redeem the scalps not for cash, but often for guns, gunpowder, supplies, horses, things that had value to them. In the center, this is one of more than 100 scalping proclamations or scalp acts that were passed in the British colonies. This one is from Massachusetts in 1755. And again, just how normalized this is. This is basically a 1700s version of a cut and paste job. If you look at this, the text is different in certain places. This is basically the proclamation in its template form, and then they just fill in the blanks with the name of the specific tribe that they're targeting. So in this case, let's see, they're calling for every male Penobscot, right? So this is the Penobscot tribe, above the age of 12 years, 50 pounds sterling. For every scalp of a male Indian above the age aforesaid, 40 pounds. So again, different rates, pay rates based on the age and gender of the scalps that are redeemed. On the top right, that's Hannah Dustin. She, to my knowledge, the only female practitioner or perpetrator of scalp warfare. It's a very interesting case. Hannah Dustin, in the 1690s, she lived in Haverhill, Massachusetts. A group of Indians raided the town and took her captive, along with another woman and her infant child. They killed the child, and sometime afterwards, in the days after, there were 12 Indians who took her captive, and all of them went to sleep one night. They were returning to, these were, I believe, Pequot, from the Pequot tribe. And all 12 of them went to sleep, and Hannah Dustin and her other female companion grabbed axes and clubs and killed all but 2 of them. And at that point, you might think that 2 adult women, Hannah Dustin was about 40 years old, and I believe she had 9 children, that having been taken captive and having just killed 10 of your captors with, handheld weapons, that they would immediately run and try to find safety somewhere. They did not do that. After killing their 10 captors, they then took the time to scalp all 10 of them and then carried the 10 scalps back to Boston and redeemed them for the cash bounty. And now, she was a Puritan, and she could not legally accept the bounty, so her husband accepted the bounty on her behalf. But again, I mean, it's just a really striking episode that really sort of displays the financial incentives and the power that had as a driving force behind scalp warfare. And finally, a couple of more modern events just to demonstrate the ways in which scalp warfare still continues to have impacts, very real impacts on Native peoples, on victims. On the left, this is a statue of Edward Cornwallis in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Cornwallis was the author of one of these scalping proclamations in the 1750s, and this is the statue being removed just a few years ago. So similar to what we see around the country with Confederate monuments and statues, here we see, and there had been a years-long effort by modern descendants of the tribe that his scalping proclamation had targeted to have his statue removed. And the park was also named after him, and they renamed the park. I think they renamed it Peace and Reconciliation Park. And finally, this is from just a year ago, alleged Native American scalp seized from auction house that specializes in Confederate and Nazi memorabilia. Just a year ago, an auction house in Maine was reported to the FBI for auctioning off a Mescalero Apache scalp from the 19th century. And the FBI raided the auction house, so this is in violation of NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act that was passed in, I believe, 1990. So the FBI raided the auction house, and I have not been able to find any updates on the story, so as far as I'm aware, the investigation of that is still ongoing. But just two of many examples that I could show of very modern current events and the ways in which scalp warfare and as a form of genocidal colonial conquest directed at Native Americans continues to loom large today in the lives of many descendants. And with that, I will conclude and take any questions that you might have.
I want to ask a little bit more about, this was great, by the way, I learned a lot, it was really interesting. Oh, sorry. So you talked about how it's sorry, my accent is going to mess this up. Scalp warfare is being used across North America by these different colonial powers. But can you talk more about the origins of that method? Like, does it have is there a kind of cultural significance attached to it? And I'm also wondering, thinking about this also as a genocidal kind of type of warfare, whether the spiritual implications for Apaches was part of the calculations for the paramilitary raiders. Like, was the choice of the scalp not just the part of the killing, but also that spiritual future destruction kind of that is part of genocidal warfare?
Thank you. Both great questions. So to answer the first question, the origins of scalping or corporeal mutilation more broadly, there were some instances where instead of cutting off the scalps, they cut off ears and redeemed ears. So it wasn't always scalps, but it usually was. I'm very careful to differentiate in scalp warfare scalping that was practiced as as part of the violence of colonial conquest against Native Americans, and scalping that Native Americans conducted for their own cultural and spiritual purposes. There are many different Indian tribes going back into pre-Columbian times had traditions that involved scalping of enemies. And that's something that I don't get into at all, because it really is a totally separate kind of an issue that doesn't fall within the framework of genocide, conquest, etc. So different tribes had different histories and traditions that involved various forms of mutilation of enemy corpses. As far as where did scalping originate as a method of warfare and violence among colonizers, the earliest example that I'm aware of a bounty being paid for Indian body parts is in the 1640s in Dutch New York, and so it originates pretty early on in the 17th century, and most historians and anthropologists who have studied this seem to agree that it was the impetus behind it was to adopt something that colonists already saw indigenous peoples doing, but not necessarily understanding what the cultural or spiritual motivations might have been from the indigenous perspective, and simply adopting it as what they would have viewed as a convenient way to document or to confirm the number of people who were killed, so that they could then monetize it. And can you remind me the second question?
You answered both.
So I think, yeah, no, okay. So the spiritual aspect with respect to Mexico specifically, I have not encountered any evidence to suggest that the men who were killing and scalping Apaches had any knowledge whatsoever of the Apache view of the afterlife, and that they were not doing it deliberately to inflict that type of emotional trauma. They were now, had they known that, it would not have changed anything. They wouldn't have cared. But they were simply doing it because that's what the government that they were contracting for told them they had to do to get their money. If the government had told them that they had to bring in the entire corpse in its unmutilated, they would have done that too to get the money. So no, I don't see any evidence that there was any deliberateness based on indigenous sort of spiritual views. Yes.
Thank you. That was a great talk. Most of the time I'm loud enough on my own. The rituals you describe, for example, in Chihuahua in 1846, I was quite fascinated by the public element and the involvement of the church. So it resonates a little bit like almost like a pilgrimage or a church festival. Do you know of any traditions they draw on, or is it kind of made up out of thin air in that particular moment? Can you tell us anything about that?
I don't know of any specific traditions that they're drawing on, but it was routine, especially in Mexico. Anytime that one of these massacres took place, that the entire town, in this case it was Ciudad Chihuahua, because that was the state capital where they had to go to take the scalps to redeem them for the money. The entire town would turn out in celebration. So it basically became, and it also speaks to just how much hatred existed between these groups, where basically your everyday civilians living in Chihuahua City felt that it was something to celebrate and to go out and have a parade that Apaches had been killed, and there were two major such parades. One of them was in 1846, and an almost identical incident occurred in 1880 in the same city, Ciudad Chihuahua, when a group of Mexicans killed the Apache chief Victorio. And they killed him at Tres Castillos in northern Mexico. And it was like a carbon copy repeat when you read the descriptions of the parade through the streets of Ciudad Chihuahua in 1880, of the Galeana massacre and the celebration after Kirker's scalping of about 150 Apaches. And the same thing, in that case in 1880, the U.S. consulate officer who was in Ciudad Chihuahua he sent a letter back to the State Department in D.C. describing his eyewitness account, and once again the priest and the mayor led the parade with scalps on poles, and they paid the person who killed. There wasn't a scalp bounty in effect at that time, but they still paid these men a bunch of reward money for having done this.
There's such a pilgrimage element in it, that I find just fascinating. Thank you.
And I think that Ruxton, who I mentioned, who describes in 1846, he saw something there that he was really perplexed by, but he doesn't give any answers, but he was obviously really interested in the celebratory part of it and the role of everyday people, the church, and so on. So.
I echo what they have said. Wonderful talk. Thank you so much. And I have a couple of questions. One is, in the context of Mexico, you have soon, by the 1850s, you have Benito Juarez and all that being indigenous to Zapotec, but from southern parts of, well, south of here, what we're talking about. And so is this struggle between conservatives and the liberals that emerge, how does that fix into this? Because I was trying to figure out, what is the motivation of the Mexican government? Is it a struggle between the state and the federales? I mean, is it just about money? Or are we trying to get a land grab? I mean, is it just, I mean, the business is for getting, I understand the incentive of these folks to, I mean, I don't agree with it, but, you know, the incentive to participate in getting the scalps is a financial one and a gain. But why are they paying money out to get that? And of course, my first thought was land grab, but is it these, okay, there's a lot of questions in my mind. I'll start with that, so.
Thank you. So with respect to the politics, the Mexican politics surrounding this, it does revolve in a lot of ways around the centralism and regionalism or federalism of the time. So the two sort of political, I guess, dichotomies. It's an overly simplistic dichotomy, but and it's really reflective of the regionalist view in northern Mexico that the centralist or conservative element of southern Mexico had abandoned or ignored the northern frontier. So for many, many years, people living all across northern Mexico, which would include New Mexico, Texas at the time, Sonora, Chihuahua, Coahuila, felt that the Mexican government was not providing adequate military protection from Apache and Comanche raids into Mexico. Brian DeLay writes about this in his book, War of a Thousand Deserts. And in the absence of traditional military force provided by the federal government of Mexico, local governments in this sort of regionalist brand of politics just adopted their own techniques and their own measures. And scalp warfare is a perfect example of that occurring. There were, and people throughout northern Mexico also, I mean, they were angry that they were paying taxes, and they felt that the government should help them in various ways, which included stationing troops around their towns to fight Apaches and Comanches. And when the Mexican government failed to do this repeatedly over many decades, these local governments take matters into their own hands, which was just really typical of the time and the ways that Mexican politics worked throughout the northern part of the country. So, and as far as monetizing and incentivizing, I think that that just became the common technique that it worked really well. They were paying so much money that a lot of people were taking up this practice and becoming perpetrators of scalp warfare, and the amount of money that these governments were paying is also indicative of just how committed they were to exterminating the Apache tribe. And they use that language very bluntly. In a lot of these weekly newspaper articles, the language of extermination is there. There's no doubt about what their intent was. They literally call over and over and over again the state governments for the extermination of the Apaches.
So to just clarify, that extermination is to get their land, or because they weren't incorporated into the Mexican state, or all of the above?
A lot of it stems from violence that went back into the 1700s with Apache raiding into Mexico. It wasn't so much about land. It was more about race. The language is there's the rhetoric of the barbarism, savagery. There was a very clear and constant sort of underlying racial motivation in the hatred that drove this. And you know, really, with the Apache tribe itself, and the same thing with the Comanche tribe in Texas and the South Plains, the tribal homelands were a long way away from any major population centers in northern Mexico. It wasn't so much about you know, attempting to eliminate them because there was a desire for the land that they, you know, were living on. And really that doesn't come until, that has more to do with the U.S. Government in the 1870s and 80s. After gold is discovered in the Apache homelands in the 1860s, then there becomes an impetus for removal by the U.S. government in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, and eventually culminates when Geronimo surrenders in 1886. The U.S. government moves most of the Apache tribe to Florida, and eventually then to Alabama, and then to Oklahoma, where many of them are today. So the land motivation comes later on and is more tied to the U.S. government, which the U.S. government did not ever enact any scalp bounties. So the scalp warfare, scalp bounty aspect is specific to the Mexican governments during this time period.
Thank you.
Sure.
Billy, I think we're almost out of time, but I would like to ask to kind of connect this with some of what we talked about crossing borders. And you mentioned it at the end, this idea of racialized violence. And so we see celebratory racialized violence, what one author of Dark Trophies talks about. The idea that if we look at the U.S. West, if we look at Mexico, right, we can also look at the war in the Pacific during World War II, U.S. forces against Japanese forces taking body parts. We saw it also with Nat Turner's revolt and literally taking body parts. You know, a coin purse is made out of part of Nat Turner's skin. So this racialized aspect that crosses different times and different places, as you talked about at the end. And to Katrine's point about the role of the church, what this also reminds me of, if we're talking about the Holocaust in specific, is looking at the Baltic states and the role of some priests in these kind of, if you will, after killing mass celebrations, where the killers, Lithuanian, Latvian, would go to the church and almost have their own contratto de sangre, if you will, in taking the body and blood of Christ in, you know, Eucharistic form. So I think we see another parallel where the church as an entity plays its own role in kind of blessing, if you will, in a very macabre way, this kind of violence. But I would like to thank our audience, and I would like to again thank you for a really fascinating talk and for sharing your expertise. And we look forward to seeing the book.
Thank you.